Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls. Thank you for joining me on this most festive of occasions. Tonight is my favorite night of the year, where the air begins to crisp and the leaves turn golden brown, where things seem a bit spookier and scarier. Tonight is Halloween. To celebrate, I'll be reading to you a selection of terrifying tales to put you in the best October mood possible. I want to thank each and every one of the authors for providing their stories on the internet to share with each and every one of you. I'd like to thank you all for your annual support, not just during the spooky season, but truly all year long. It means a great deal to me, and from the bottom of my horrifying heart to yours, I hope you have a safe, a spooky, and a happy Halloween. Am I going to be charged with murder? The detective sighed and did not answer. His eyes were tired, haunted. Just help us get to the bottom of this, he said. Okay, I answered. I'll do my best. I could hear the tremor in my voice. I hadn't stopped shaking since it happened. I'd had a strong drink to settle my nerves. It hadn't worked. Let's start at the beginning, said the detective. You were having a Halloween party. Yeah, I said. We do it every year. We take turns hosting, and the whole block participates. This year it was our turn. So you're the one that set up the decorations? Yeah, I said. Oh God, that sounds bad. But it wasn't just me, it was lots of people. I was mostly just supervising. Can you give me a list of who was involved? Yeah, it was, I'm sorry. I'm all over the place. Just give me a moment to calm down. I can give you the list. That's okay. We can come back to that. Okay. So, who was it that set up the scarecrow? It was me, I said, but I didn't do that. I set it up the night before. Someone must have come in during the night and... Oh, God. The room swayed, and my breath came sharp and fast. My heart ratcheted up its pace to breakneck speed, and darkness began to close in around my vision. Hey, the detective said. Just calm down. You're hyperventilating. Take long, calm breaths. I did as he said. My heart slowed, but the panic remained. Thanks, I said. Do you think you can keep going? He asked. Yeah, I said. Just give me a moment. My body convulsed with tremors, but in a few minutes they had settled down to a mild shaking in my hands. I gulped down a hard knot in my throat. Okay, I said. Okay, I'm ready. So the scarecrow, the detective prompted. The word filled me with dread. The scarecrow, I repeated numbly. It's a Halloween tradition. The neighbors said as much. You destroy it every year? Yeah, I said. Usually it's filled with candy and straw. You know, like a piñata. The kids beat it with sticks and everyone has a good time. I just don't understand. God, why would someone do that? It's too early to speculate, said the detective. Right now we're just gathering the facts. When did you notice that something was wrong? Well, right away I noticed that the scarecrow wasn't coming apart as easily as it should have been. but I just thought I had put it together too well, so I grabbed a stick and, yes, I took a swing. The detective leaned forward. And then what happened? My shoulders slumped. My mouth was cottony and dry. And then, I said, the scarecrow began to bleed, and there was a pregnant pause. The detective's eyes bored into mine, willing me to continue. He said nothing, and I had to fill the silence. It fell over, I said. The hat came off, and we saw that it was a body. What happened then? The kids started screaming. One girl started it, the Oakley girl, I think, and then they all went off. The other parents and I, we pulled them all away, and we called the police, and that's it. You know the rest. The detective scribbled his last note and folded the fold-top notebook he'd been writing in. His eyes were hard, dull, gray stone, impossible to read. When he spoke again, his words were measured, careful. His voice was soft. "What interests me, Mr. Johnson," he said, "is that you haven't asked about your wife." The question caught me completely off guard. "My wife?" I said. "She's out of town. Oh, God, she's going to freak out when she found out what happened. She hates the block party enough as it is." "Your wife is out of town?" prodded the detective. The question poked at a fresh wound. "Yes," I said, forgetting my fear in a moment of irritation. "She and my son are spending the holiday with her parents in Virginia." "It seems strange," the detective said. "A family celebrating a holiday apart?" I got the feeling he knew something more than he was letting on. "Have you talked to her?" I said. "I'd like to hear your side." "My wife and I are going through a rough patch right now," I said, "but I don't see why this is relevant." "It's our job to gather all the information," he said. "Then we can decide what is and is not relevant. Why was your wife not spending the holiday with you?" I sighed. I wasn't proud of it, but I was getting flustered. I could feel hot blood rising to my face. "We separated," I said. "Why is that?" "It's personal. Your wife said that it was related to infidelity." "So you have talked to her?" "Yes." "Fine," I said. "You know, I cheated on my wife. I destroyed my family. It's all my fault. Now I've had one hell of a day, and if you don't mind, can you please tell me what the hell this has to do with anything?" The detective paused. He spoke softly. "Your wife is in police custody, Mr. Johnson." "What?" "I'm sorry I have to tell you this," he said, "but she has rendered a full confession." "A full confession for what? What the hell are you talking about?" "It happens occasionally in cases of separation," he said. "One party feels the need to punish the other. Unfortunately, the children are sometimes used as a tool to that end." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The room swam. Bile rose in my throat. "Oh, God," I gasped. "Oh, God, no." "I'm afraid we have positively identified the remains as belonging to your son, Ben," he said. The scream died in my throat. I blacked out. "6 months have passed since the cool winds of September raked through the brittle grass of Valley Glen like fingers in an old woolen blanket, yet the fall has not since ended. That same cold breeze, as sharp and as bitter as a dagger at midnight, still cuts through the piles of shriveled brown bodies that line the streets, and the deep blue hue of the sky has saturated to a shade beyond what any of us could have ever dared to comprehend. It is an eternal blue. The fall started, just as most often do, after a hot, wet summer that crescendoed into a clangy, thunderous lightning storm. Mama and I were out rocking on the porch step. We had exhausted the day, plucking our small orchard nearly bare of fresh apples, when the air began to taste of oncoming rain, and the song of the cicadas swiftly stopped like a spinning record without a needle. We watched and waited until the pitter-patter on the tin roof began, and then the crack of God's whip licked the sky with a scab of light, and down came the rest of the water. It was a heavy rain, heavier than any other that summer. Yet, from where we were perched, Mama and I were dry as bones. The cattle, however, were not as fortunate, and while the pigs might have had a field day in the fresh mud, all of the other critters of the night were hunkered down as we were, including the chickens in their coop and the dog from the yard. Old Betsy had found her way under Mama's chair, after I had spoiled her with the rest of my half-chewed Honeycrisp, and continued in that position until we called it a night. Thus ended the last day of summer. When we awoke the following morning, a fresh September morning, neither Mama nor myself expected the harsh transition into the fall equinox that awaited us outside. The sky was now a bright, cheery blue, every drop of rain 6 feet under the dew-covered browning grass, and the trees radiated that same yellow as the sunlight, spun with hints of red like gala apples. We moseyed on down the steps and into the yard, taking Betsy with us, and there wasn't a trace of humidity in the air to be found. It was a crisp air, nearly as crinkled as the leaves beneath our boots, and as cool and nippy as we had hoped for after the dog days had ended. The dog and other animals felt the same. Old Betsy was frolicking, the cows were grazing what little green grass remained, and the chickens were out of their coop. The mud had dried, but it didn't stop the pigs from their play. Scattered across our land, and all throughout Valley Glen, were the shed leaves of maple and ash, same as the ones that snapped as we strutted. The children kicked them down empty blocks and rode them to school as passengers in their spokes. Despite the breeze that stung like a bumblebee, there was a certain warmth throughout our little town, and as soon as I had bundled myself in that gifted jacket from Mama that hung in the closet since Christmas past, I could feel it, too. Thus ended the first day of autumn. The sight that beheld us the following morning was nothing shy of disorienting. In fact, I had mistakenly assumed myself to be drunk on rum when I had first noticed the color coming through the window blinds. A blue, nearly purple shade that stretched across the room like a rug. I had hopped from my slumber in thinking I had slept well past the morning dew, but the still clicking clock swore to me that it was only 6:15. Peering through the window only furthered my suspicions. The sky was a near black, and the rising sun appeared to be setting already. The shrubbery along the window's sill was also alarming, nearly kissed brown, with splotches of bare branches. The entire landscape looked as if God had laden his brush heavy with the idyllic colors of an auburn twilight, only the day had just begun. Thus, in the same way it had started, ended the second day of autumn. On the third day, just as all the days since, the darkness of night was broken by the unrelenting gaze of blue that swept throughout our land, only day by day increasing in its saturation. It is as if a sponge has been left to soak in a bucket of paint, and day by day, what little hint of orange or yellow remained in that sky slowly rots into blackish blue. It is not only the sky that rots, however, but the trees, the grasses, and the rest of summer's flora. In their places, laced across the front and backyards alike, wrap the gangling vines of gourds and pumpkins that grow far beyond what God himself had intended. One such, a great squash of the Connecticut fields, had, by that point, eclipsed the tire of my '68 Chevy like it were the moon. It has since engulfed it. That afternoon, as the last of summer's warm breezes clashed against the howling winds of autumn's birthing pains, there was a great storm that rattled the house and shook the trees, dumping a great many leaves into the yard and scattering them about. The continued gusts of cold air struck the windows and rolled some of the gourds down the hills like oblong bowling balls, and the surges of power they caused by snap power lines throughout Valley Glen rendered my CPAP breathing machine useless, and I dared not sleep that night without it. Thus ended the third day of autumn. The morning that followed, I had awoken with a strain in my eyes. Though the blinds were all closed, and the doors all shut, the house was bathed in the vivid hue of a vibrant blue, and the cold nip of the outside air. I checked the thermostat. It was nearly 40 degrees. In a place like Valley Glen, a temperature that chilly was only seen around Christmas time, never that early in the year. My wife had felt it too. She had awoken with a cough, a cold, and I fared my best to remedy her symptoms with a piping warm mug of coffee drizzled with the honey from the comb. She thanked me and sat before the foggy window, bundled in a blanket, until calling me over to make note of the outstretched vines that had traveled down the lonesome road toward Valley Glen Square. The gourds were now the size of terracotta clay jars, and the pumpkins were as wide as hay bales. Bent over them like crooked, jagged guardian angels were the barren trees that spread their leaves far and wide, so far and wide that not even a blade of browning grass saw the sun. And that spectre, too, that yellow spectre, despite having only just arisen, reared his glistening head for what seemed to be only moments before ducking beneath the horizon again and shading the land in pitch-black darkness. Thus ended the fourth, short day of autumn. The fifth began, as the fourth had, with the sheer sheen of the cloudless autumn sky and the raspy coughing of my wife beside me. She had been gasping for breath all night, and when we had finally tuckered out from restlessness, it seemed that rest was only a short reprieve. When we both had awoken to the brightness through the window blinds, I had wrongfully assumed her complexion to be a result of the strange colors that emitted from outside. I was wrong. Her skin was now the shade of a duckling, as if she were ill from jaundice, and her sunken eyes were the deeper, richer tint of the same color, nearly orange. Her hair was falling out in clumps, and she had lost a tooth in the night. She gripped me with one hand, coughed into her other, and, as it trembled, extended the sprinkled red along her yellowed fingers to my eyes. I had called Dr. Sampson not 5 minutes later, after bringing poor Mama a glass of cold water, nearly frozen despite being left on the kitchen counter the night before. Dr. Sampson answered abruptly, as if expected, and informed me of her symptoms before I even uttered a word. My wife, it seems, was not alone to suffer her illness in Valley Glen. However, just as for the others, not much was there to change, but to let whatever it was simply run its course. For the remainder of the day, Mama sat silently, except for the whimpers of Betsy beneath her rocker, and watched as the foul, deep blue of the empty air, void of any fowl that might have migrated south prematurely, seeped into every corner of the sky above, and the orange and brown crept across the ground below. The only hint of greenery to be seen were those few select trees that, for whatever God's reasons, never seemed to shed their leaves. The evergreens. It was that ever so green that was a comfort in some strange way to the both of us, though the companionship of that tinge was only short-lived. Before long, the screeching sunset, even earlier on arrival than the day before, burned every color of the earth and deep blue sky above into a molten shade of orange, like a Currier and Ives print if the colors began to bleed out onto the floor. Thus ended the 5th day of autumn. There was a great squealing that had awoken me from my slumber the morning of the 6th day, and immediately I had clutched the cold hand of Mama to make sure she was all right. It wasn't her. The screaming, instead, had come from outside, beyond the windows of which rich blue light seemed to ooze into our farmhouse. I had taken my coat from the rack and made it a step down the creaking porch stairs when my slipper slipped into a thick bundling of dried-out leaves, a pile of crackling orange and brown, whose colors were far deeper than my foot. I lifted my shoe from its depths, but as I surveyed the rest of the yard, I realized rather quickly that there was no alternate footing. The entirety of our land was coated in fallen leaves, a layer of rustling litter at least a foot deep. Then the squealing came again, this time louder and seemingly closer. I trudged through the browning colors in my pajamas and jacket until I reached the splintering fence which beyond it held in the likes of those chickens and their coop and the cattle and the pigs. No such creatures stirred any more. Instead, the wailing of the hog which had awoken me came from beneath a dense pile of leaves, and I brushed them aside to see Clarabelle, our pot belly, sputter a gurgle of blood and fall limp against the dead grass beneath her. There was a fungus and a great many toadstools protruding from her skin, and all around her, along the patch of earth, were budding mushrooms that stuck out from between mounds of leaves and the carcasses of the cattle who had grazed the grasses bare. Clarabelle was always Mama's pig, and I had taken the bell around her neck with me as I plodded back up to our home, reverently holding it in my shivering hands and wondering how to break the news to my wife that all the livestock, including her prized pig, were now dead. But there were bigger problems inside. Mama was sitting at the table, the steam from a piping cup of joe rising from her grip. She turned to me with a faded, cracked smile, and I stopped cold in my tracks. My wife was orange, and the thin skin that surrounded her beady, sunken eyes was a sickly brown. They were the same saturated tones as the leaves that fluttered across the lawn. Immediately, I tried to hoist her to her feet, but her weight nearly snapped between my arms. She fell back into the seat with another tired cough and shook her head, a silent no. I clutched her cold hands in mine, still holding the bell. She took in a breath, which was increasingly harder to do as the fall continued, and gazed up at me tearfully, her lips cracking audibly. I began to weep as she fell into herself. Thus ended the 6th day of autumn. I failed to rest all night, merely sat up in bed and watched as the blackness brightened into blue outside, but was awoken from whatever stupor may have clutched me by the hideous odor that penetrated my nostrils. The air was thin enough already, but when the stench had seized me, I gasped and burst into a fit of coughing and nearly vomited out on the floor. I grabbed my CPAP machine resting nearby and pressed it to my lips as if it were a gas mask from the Great War, and huffed and puffed. I could, for once in many days, breathe again. Downstairs, my wife, or rather, the husk that my now dearly departed had left behind, was rotten, withered in that chair in the kitchen. Old Betsy had smelled her too, only the soft white fur from her coat was now the shade of cinnamon as she whined at Mamma's shriveled feet. The mug of coffee was still placed beside her on the table, frozen over as the temperature only grew chiller, and I reached out to touch her brown skin. Her fingers snapped upon the lightest brush of my hand and crumbled to the floor. I gagged into my mask and ran to the other side of the room, where the only comfort to be found was the basket of apples that never made their way into one of Mamma's pies. They were all a putrid brown and writhing with worms. That afternoon, I had called Dr. Sampson again after covering all the doors and windows, wherever that blue light leaked through. It now hurt to stare at for long periods, and the mere color dug into my jaw and rang the drums of my ears. When the doctor finally did answer, he sounded both excitable and terrified all in the same breath. He begged of me not to go outside, not to dare smell it, and I questioned him why, but he never gave a cohesive answer. He rambled on about leaves and lungs, the mutual exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and how the earth itself was shedding. I then asked of him why, then, both of us were still breathing what little air we had, but he didn't know. I did, however. We were the evergreens. Unfortunately for old Betsy, though, she was not. Before the day was through, that cinnamon-colored fur had completely fallen off, like needles from a larch, only leaving behind the wrinkly skin of a now bolden bitch. Until, at last gasp, that had fallen off too. Thus ended the first week of autumn. Before long, despite how grueling it might have seemed, that week became weeks. Halloween came and went, the most frightening of them all by mere virtue of the season, and then those weeks became months, 6 terrible months, so much as we can tell. Those of us who dared to step outside, perhaps with no alternative, our eyes covered and bodies wrapped in what warmth we had, took to throwing as many bodies as we could manage into the warming bonfires that crackle now, day and night, along the hills to rid Valley Glen of the smell that keeps many of us awake. The ones that remain, left on curbs of which children no longer walk nor ride their bicycles, merely seep back into the earth and keep the cornstalks and gourds and pumpkins ever growing, their scent so potent that a whiff of the wind tastes of one of Mamma's pies and goads me to gag and cry every time. Every autumnal meal, the same squash, day in and day out, elicits the same reaction. Everything outside our windows remains frozen in place just as the fall has been, and we often collectively contemplate whether or not the strange season of the valley lingers beyond its borders, especially where it is not yet autumn. The clocks, however, have lost all purpose of their ticking, and therefore we cannot tell with any certainty whether or not we have even reached the winter months as we suspect. All we know is that the days grow ever shorter, some seemingly less than mere hours, what used to be hours. Father Briggs, now, raves on at the pulpit, foaming at the lip, about the end of days we have found ourselves in. He swears that death's harvest will be plentiful, and that, perchance, the colors of hell have fallen onto the earth in shades of fire and brimstone. It seems that even Dr. Sampson believes his rantings. We pray daily that the warmth of a radiant spring will thaw the once lively town of Valley Glen and end this endless fall. I only fear, if an impending spring buds what fauna and flora lie in the wake of autumn and winter's chill back to life, perhaps this eternal autumn is sparing us from whatever, whomever else may spring along with it. I propped the gourd on the table after I laid down the newspapers to keep the juices from running out. I then took a knife and drove it into it. It had a rough rind, but with a few direct strikes, it opened. Unfortunately for me, the juices spilled on the floor, forcing me to lay down towels. Afterward, I sketched the spots for the eyes and mouth, and I sliced into the gourd. The surface once again proved rough, but I gradually got the hang of it. Juice seeped out from the areas I sketched. Lastly, I made a deep cut on the top. I needed a sharper blade for it. With the gooey residue exposed, I scooped it out thoroughly and placed a candle inside. Now all that's left to do is get around to carving those pumpkins. The sound of another knock at our door woke me from my short nap. The clock read 8:17. Still another hour before they would all go home. I stood up and stretched. Then another knock came at our door. "Are you going to get that?" my wife groaned from across the room. Yes. I started to walk, but the pins and needles in my right leg almost stopped me. I opened the door to see it standing there unblinking. "Trick or treat." This one was wearing a scream mask and was covered in black clothes. I dropped 2 chocolate bars into his large, pumpkin-shaped basket. He said thanks, and then walked away. I closed the door and sat back down on the couch, hoping to maybe get some more shut-eye. Then came another knock. I got up quickly, grabbed 2 more bars of chocolate from our bucket, and headed for the door. There were 2 of them this time. 2 girls, one dressed as a princess and the other as a fairy, typical for girls their age. I dropped 1 chocolate bar into each basket. They were about to say thank you, but I closed the door. I'll have more time to relax. Too bad if they think I'm rude. I began to relax again, but instead of napping, I thought about the day when Anne and I would have a kid. We would have to send him up to random strangers' front doors. Then they would give him candy, and I heard another knock. I was too relaxed to even care this time. Let's convince them we're not home. Maybe they'll go away. Then they knocked again. I heard Anne groan loudly and get up, and she started for the door. "Honey, She stopped me mid-sentence with a simple "shut up," and continued walking. I heard the door open and the sound of candies dropping into baskets, then talking. This one was a little girl, and after a few seconds, I heard Anne say, "Aw, poor baby." The girl clearly said, "Can I come in?" My wife responded with, "Sure, I think we have a few bandages." I sat up, and the children, there was a boy following the girl, had come in as far as our boot rack. The girl had a green witch mask on, and the boy had a zombie mask. They had no costume except for the masks, just plain clothes. My wife returned with the bandages. The girl held her wrist out, and Anne wrapped a bandage around the girl's small cut. The girl proceeded to slip off her mask and glare at me. "Nice, contacts," was all I managed to say. Her eyes were as black as night, and her skin an oddly pale white. She just grinned at me, and I realized something felt off. Very off. "Honey, can I talk to you quickly in private?" She gave me an odd look, but still said, "Sure." We walked into the kitchen and stood in front of the oven, where they couldn't hear us. "Something's not right here," I decided to say what first came to my mind. "What?" Now she looked at me even more oddly. No response came to my mind. She just said, "You say that every time Dolores gives me cookies or a loaf of bread. Stop being paranoid." She walked off. Then I heard her gasp. I walked out slowly, only to see 2 masks and 2 buckets in the place of the 2 children. The buckets only had 2 pieces of candy each, the candy we gave them. Strange. I didn't hear them leave. Maybe they didn't leave. She only gave me that look again. Maybe they're in here somewhere, planning to steal something. Yeah, right. We don't even have anything worth... We both heard it. A scratching sound in the back bedroom. We looked at each other and began to walk down the hallway. Even though I thought they were just children, I had this very odd feeling about them. Probably the eyes. As we neared the doorway to the bedroom, a loud growling sound came from inside the doorway. It was like a dog's growl, only deeper. "Honey, did you hear that?" Silence. "Honey?" I said as I turned around. I was alone. In the place of my wife was only darkness. A chill ran down my spine, but I continued walking. I mustered up as much courage as I could, jumped inside and turned on the light. The boy was there. He was clawing at a spot in the middle of the room, as if looking for something. He looked up and smiled. His mouth was full of sharp, pointed teeth, his eyes as black as the girl's. I began to back up. "What the Honey!" A familiar voice came from behind me. I turned around and Anne was standing there. She grabbed the sides of my face and stared into my eyes. "It will all be over soon," she said sweetly, as my face began to feel odd. Then I noticed something about her eyes. They were as black as night, too. Slowly, everything began to fade away into nothing. The police came to Daniel and Anne's house at 1:08 a.m. that night after their neighbor, Dolores Bridge, heard some screaming coming from within the house. All that was found that was deemed suspicious were the masks, baskets, and a hole in the middle of the bedroom floor which had the skeletons of 2 small children at the bottom of it and 1 silver cross. The skeletons were found in a position which suggested they were killed in some sort of ritual. After some research, Police found that the neighbor, Dolores, had 2 children, and that they had gone missing 17 years ago. The dusk air was clogged with the sense of deep-fried food, the air clouded with the exclamations of hundreds of happy carnival goers as they sped through rides with reckless abandon. It was the perfect evening, the joyous atmosphere filling the hearts and minds of everyone there with enough fun to last until their next adventure. I couldn't help but smile my brightest, widest grin. It was the season of carnivals, fairs, and outdoor festivals. The sweet smell of cotton candy washed over the land like a flash flood. The bright emerald of my eyes swept over the masses, spying large, overstuffed animals bobbing through the crowd as children and adults alike totted their prizes through the fairgrounds. Everyone here tonight was a child at heart, including myself. Spying one of my favorite carnival treats, the fun house, I giddily trotted toward the old converted trailer in search of those infamous mirrors and cheap pranks. My friends had all gone in search of their favorite greasy fair delicacies, leaving me to my own devices. While I disliked going on most of the rides by my lonesome, I could more than handle the various mysteries inside the funhouse. After all, they were mostly geared to scare children. Most of them I had seen 1,000,000 times and at most provided me with a chuckle or two. Once in a while, something would jump out and startle me, but even then the prank was met with laughter. It was a fun house, after all. I took a few tickets from my pocket, taking inventory as I read the sign outside the old trailer. A young Hispanic man stood by the door, his smile only broken by a sip of his fresh, ice-cold lemonade he held in his right hand. As people entered, he would smile and nod, placing their tickets in his pocket. It was 5 tickets to enter. I had exactly 7. What a fine way to end my magical night at the fair. Passing the little light blue squares of paper off to the vendor, I merrily stepped up to the stairs and into the dark interior of the large refurbished trailer. I had to blink a few times to adjust my eyes to the light. Pausing for just a moment, I pulled the length of my long, red hair back over my shoulders and secured it with the purple hair tie from my left wrist. I was ready to have some fun, all by my lonesome. As I began down the tiny, dark corridor, I could hear the echoes of the people who entered before me, chuckling and squealing. I heard a couple up ahead, the woman giggling like a schoolgirl after her boyfriend, or male counterpart, I should say, instead of making assumptions, let out a frightened cry. I quietly uttered a chuckle. Men usually seemed to be the biggest chickens when it came to these types of thrills. As I rounded the first dark corner, I was met with my first scare. An old prop of a hanging man flew out from the way, its limbs flailing around limply from the sudden jolt that had forced it from its place in the wall. I jumped, my body flooded with an anxious tingling that seemed to dissipate out through my fingers and toes. I chuckled, pushing the dummy aside as I headed further into the funhouse. There was something odd as my fingers had pushed against the prop. It had felt slightly warm and gooey. Great effects. Perhaps they had actually put some effort into the things this year. After another couple feet, a ghastly glowing sheet came flying across the ceiling, accompanied by the familiar ghostly sounds Halloween had made famous. My green sights followed the sheet until it disappeared into a back wall. Without a second thought, I made my way further down the hall. Before long, I came to another corridor. My face almost meeting the black wall rather abruptly, if not for my toes hitting the painted cardboard. I blinked, squinting for a moment to gather my bearings again. It was easy to get lost in places like this, the black interior and lack of lighting leaving you disoriented and easier to spook. Before I had time to recover from my encounter with the wall, there was a horrifying shriek, followed by another cheap prop dislodging from the wall. I let out a squeal of surprise, falling back onto the floor as the dummy swung back and forth in front of me. It had several flashing green LED lights scattered around it in odd places. I chuckled as I plucked myself back up from off the floor. I gave my butt a rub or two, my cheeks a little sore from the tumble. It was nothing big, especially not compared to the thrills I was getting this time around. I started off again, the dummy having the same warm, gooey texture as the last. This time, however, my fingers came away wet. I frowned a bit as I wiped them off on my jeans, probably glue from those little dollar store LED lights. Perhaps the vendor could offer me some wet wipes afterwards. It would only be right, since it was their sloppiness that had caused it. There were several more props that dislodged from the dark walls, their little trapdoors squeaking as they popped open to spit out some thrills. Various painted cries, shrieks, and Halloween sound effects echoed through the halls. I couldn't hear any more people in the trailer. They must have all made it out already. I was having a blast, my voice bouncing through the darkness with chuckles and squeals. I hadn't thought twice about the grotesque creativity used in the props, most of the dummies appearing rather lifelike in the dark. To me, they were simply an improvement to the same old funhouse spiel. It was nice to see and feel some effort being put into this carnival classic. After about 5 minutes, I came to a door, my hands finding the knob before I even realized what was in front of me. I attempted to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. Frowning, I furrowed my brow in frustration. Removing my attention from the door, I felt my way around the hallway around me, running my fingers along the black walls. There didn't seem to be another way through. Maybe it was just jammed. I leaned my body into the door. My hands furled as tightly as they could around the little handle. I noticed something strange when I pressed up against the door. There was a low, mechanical hum coming from behind the door. I paused, pressing my ear to the black entryway as I listened intently for any other sounds. Perhaps it was the generator outside that powered the entire funhouse. Shrugging it off, I lofted a little sigh of disappointment as I realized the door was not going to budge. I had taken a wrong turn, obviously. Prepared to turn around and shuffle my way back to find the correct path, I slipped in something wet on the floor. Immediately, my stomach churned as my mind raced to assumptions. Ugh, someone had probably thrown up in here, either from fear or intoxication, and I just stepped in it. Disgust rushed through me, quickly dispelling the happy vibe that had followed me around all evening. What a great way to end the night. Now focusing more on my surroundings, I began to notice a smell. It didn't reek of vomit, but rather it was a bitter, metallic smell. Oil from the generator? No, it was a little different, more bittersweet. I scrunched my nose before heading back down the corridor. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. I had to be close to the end by now. I had a sudden desire to go find my friends and head back home for the night. My fun had been ruined by someone else's bad luck. At least, I wasn't the only one who had wandered down the wrong tunnel. Dragging my fingers along the walls, I searched for another passage. It only took a moment or two before my fingers slid around a corner to my right. I don't know how I managed to miss it before, but I turned the corner. My face smacked right into another prop as I rounded the corner. I shrieked with the sudden shock, my body instinctively falling back from whatever it was I had just run into. As I glanced up toward the source of the thrill, several LED lights flickered on and off behind it, one of those cheap Halloween sound effects blaring in the background. What I saw in those few short-lived green flashes horrified me. This time I got a good look at the dummy. Almost every last inch of its frame covered in what looked like blood. From the chest down into the stomach cavity was torn apart. Fresh, sausage-looking guts poured out onto the floor. It hung suspended by its neck from the ceiling. As I sat there on the floor, another bright green flash erupted behind it. It was then that true terror struck me. Terrified eyes rolled down toward me, peering down directly into my own. That was no dummy. Completely encompassed by the sudden onset of fear, my body went into overdrive. As my limbs began to flail beneath me in an attempt to get up, I began to slip on blood that had pooled on the floor. My heart beat feverishly against the walls of my chest, my breathing flying out of control as I began to drown in my own panic. All of those dummies, those props, they were real. I began to whimper as it all began to sink in. Digging my heels down into the floor, the best I could, I pushed myself back, crab-walking back down the corridor in search of an exit. Losing track of time, I crawled back frantically through the dark hallway for what seemed like forever until I felt like it was safe to turn around. I wanted out of that freakish house of horrors immediately. That was no fun house. Rolling around onto all fours, I became horribly aware of the racket I was making. How long have I been whimpering? Had someone heard me? Paralyzing fear threatened to break down the door to my subconscious as I crawled on all fours back the way I had come. I needed to get out of there immediately. Whoever was killing people might still be in there, and I didn't want to meet them. At long last, I saw a brightening of the dark, heavy-duty cardboard walls of the fun house. I gasped a sigh of relief, hot tears beginning to pour down my face as I hurried toward the exit. Sunlight was becoming more apparent as I crawled, its weak last rays fighting for its life against the twilight. There was shuffling behind me now in the corridor, and a low scraping sound. I whimpered loudly, my voice jagged with pure horror. I was almost out of this place. At last I reached the door from which I had entered. Throwing my hands around the door, I curled my fingers over the door jamb to thrust myself forward and on down the stairs. As my body rolled out onto the grass, a loud cry of frustration echoed from inside the trailer. I didn't waste any time. Rolling onto my stomach and pushing myself up onto my feet, again my emerald eyes rolled along the crowd, their terrified faces gawking at me as I rose to my full height. I didn't wait. I didn't stop. Breaking into tears, I pushed through the crowd, leaving bloody handprints on t-shirts and bare shoulders. I wanted to get out of there right now. When I finally found my friends, they all gathered around me in an effort to comfort my trembling frame. By then I was uncontrollably crying, my salty tears leaving streaks in the bright red blood from the funhouse. Security had already been called, and it took them very little time to find me. They had stormed the funhouse, quickly discovering the grisly remains of 11 people. The culprit had yet to be found, but they were scouring the grounds as they questioned me. I only half listened. The crowds of hundreds of people and their oversized stuffed animals suddenly terrified me. One of them, any of them, could have been the culprit. Erica folded her purple pajamas and put them in her suitcase. "There," she said. "I'm ready to go, Mom." Erica and her mother were going on vacation. Mom had made plans for them to visit Aunt Jill. Aunt Jill lived in a quaint little town near the ocean. Erica and her mother loved to visit the ocean. The sky was a bit overcast as Erica and her mother turned onto the interstate. It was already late in the afternoon. Erica gazed out the window. The skyscrapers of the city soon gave way to trees and fields. As they headed north, it started to rain. At first, big fat droplets splashed slowly against the windshield. Then, all of a sudden, the raindrops pounded fast and furiously. Mom turned on the windshield wipers as fast as they would go. Just then, there was a loud crack of thunder. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky, which had grown quite dark. "It's raining buckets," Mom declared. "I can hardly see to drive." "Maybe we should pull over," Erica said. Erica was scared. They were still several hours from Aunt Jill's house. Worse, it seemed that they were stuck in the middle of nowhere. "Look," Mom said, leaning forward and squinting. "There's an inn up ahead. Perhaps we could stay there tonight." Erica felt relieved as they pulled up to a quaint farmhouse. It was white with green shutters. The house looked very inviting. Erica and her mother grabbed their suitcases and rushed to the front porch. Thankfully, the porch was covered, providing shelter from the rain. Mom rang the doorbell. Before long, they heard footsteps in the hall. "Welcome," said the innkeeper as she opened the door. "Please come in and make yourselves at home." "We'd like to rent a room for the evening," said Erica's mother. "I hope you still have one available." "Certainly, dear," the lady said. "It's quite a storm we're having." "It sure is," Erica said. The lady led the travelers to a cozy upstairs bedroom. Erica was pleased to see a giant bed with a fluffy comforter. As thunder boomed outside, she could hardly wait to snuggle under the warm, dry covers. The next morning, Erica awoke to the sound of birds chirping. The terrible storm was over. Erica and her mother walked downstairs. The parlor looked even lovelier in the bright light of the morning. "Hello," Erica's mother called out. Erica and her mother could not find the innkeeper. Erica's mother shrugged her shoulders. "Maybe she went out for groceries," she said. "We can just leave a note." Erica's mother rummaged through her purse for some paper. She neatly wrapped a note around some money and placed them on a table in the hall. After driving a few miles, they stopped to get some gas. "Can I help you?" the boy at the gas station asked pleasantly. "We'd like a fill up," Erica's mom replied. "Sure thing," the boy said. He placed the nozzle into the gas tank. "You didn't happen to drive through that terrible storm last night, did you?" the boy continued. "As a matter of fact, we did," Erica's mom said. "Fortunately, we were able to spend the night at that charming inn a few miles back." The boy turned and looked at them. "You don't mean the white farmhouse with the green shutters?" he asked, looking puzzled. "Why, yes," Erica's mother replied. "The hostess was so kind." "But that's impossible," the boy said slowly. "That's Mrs. Flattery's old inn. It burned down several days ago." Burned down? Erica repeated in surprise. Erica's mother figured the boy was joking. She waited for him to laugh, but he seemed very serious. Erica had a creepy feeling. "Let's drive back, Mom," she suggested. "It will only take a few minutes." Erica held her breath as they approached the inn. When they pulled into the drive, she could hardly believe her eyes. Sure enough, the old house was burned, just like the boy had said. "How can that be?" Erica stammered in disbelief. "We were just here." The porch that had protected them from the rain was now sagging and burned. The windows were all broken. Carefully, Erica made her way to the opening where the front door used to be. There, she gasped. There before her was the hall table, and on it was their neatly folded note.